I will kick off the discussion mainly focusing for now at the presentation and the keynote that has been made just now. Maybe Mr. Paulius, maybe you can elaborate a bit more. You mentioned the risks that are around, definitely the investments that are going to be in the air, investing in agri-food sector. And while mentioning these risks, you also mentioned the Green Deal, the initiatives that basically are targeted to fight some of these risks. To your opinion, which of these risks are not to the level addressed by the governments and maybe, will be continuing to affect negatively the investments for the agri-food sector? So which are the ones that are not addressed by the measures and which are already addressed by different public and private measures that probably minimize the effect of these risks? Could you elaborate a bit on that? And also panelists,
Sure.
also you can chip in into this discussion on these risks. What are the key risks and what are your priorities on this? Go ahead, please.
I think the very obvious that governments haven't quite understood is the fertilizer market. That's a very short term and very immediate. We haven't seen the real price increases yet. And of course, we have geopolitical tensions related to Belarus, which is a very important supplier of potash. And we saw reactions from the Belgian government, partly from the French, who said, like, we have to address this issue because it will hit the food prices eventually. The farmers will face higher cost of fertilizers. And I think the governments are not ready yet. So that's an immediate challenge we have to address. I think, broadly speaking, just cost inflation is a big issue. People are talking a lot about the auto sector, about chips, but very few people are talking about the agri sector. And whilst you can delay the purchase of your car, I think once you see food inflation, all sorts of things can happen in politics. So I think that's something to watch for 22, and definitely that makes markets very, very uneasy.
I open this question also to the panelists. What is your opinion on the key risks that affects the investments in agri-food sector? I mean, is there anything that was not mentioned or mentioned not enough and should be highlighted, or maybe from your experience or your practical fields of operations, you see some patterns that definitely affect the prospects of the agri-food sector investments? Anyone? I should point the finger. Yeah, Grigoris, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mantas. So I think that one key parameter that we are kind of missing is the so-called green premium. By green premium, I mean the fact that in order for the farmers to go green, somebody needs to pay the bill. Farmers cannot go green if their accounts will be on red. This practically means that we will be at one point looking at who is going to pay this green premium. Now try to imagine a global economy, but also a European economy, going out of the crisis, high inflation, as mentioned before by the keynote speaker, but also a smaller disposable income for the majority of the households, and try to imagine how difficult it would be for these households to pay the green premium. I think that this is a risk that we are not currently seeing. We are all very optimistic, and we need to remain optimistic to achieve these big goals. The Green Deal is the man of the moon moment of Europe. However, at the same time, we need to remember that the green premium needs to be paid from the consumers, from the citizens, from the households at the end of the day. And this is something that I think we need to somehow tackle as we go along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very well mentioned. I mean, the aspect of the green premiums and who are going to pay this and what is the role of the government or any other institutions involved. I don't know. Mika, maybe your view on this?
Thanks. Of course, I want to take a different view on risks and opportunities because private sector is increasing investments in the whole food system all the time. It's growing year by year. And in private sector, we believe that the new solutions are actually coming outside from the current food system. The technology that will be used in farming, for example, comes outside of the current food system, and private sector is increasingly investing in those areas. So when we are talking about risks, we should probably think about a bit longer view and see that all the sustainability risks we have in the current food system today are opportunities for tomorrow. And that's how we see the point here from VC angle.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I take the opportunity also having in the room, a virtual room, the bank representation here also. I would like to ask maybe Eivilė, how the picture looks like from the window of the financial institutions, I mean, that you represent. Do you see the patterns changing, investment priorities changing, or what would be your view on this? We cannot hear you. Maybe the microphone is muted, or? No, we cannot hear you. We see you that, yeah. We have to read the lips now. Please be prepared. No, not yet. No sound. Is it something from our side?
Now it's okay, yes, because
we hear you.
Myself.
Yeah.
You were holding me that. Okay, so from the bank perspective, I would not say that this is sort of, I would agree with the previous speakers that agriculture sector is overlooked. So I wouldn't be able even to define separate strategy for this sector. And I think one of the main reasons is that it's very strongly driven by CAP, by Common Agricultural Policy, that really designs how the sector and grows and what is the future of that. But from the perspective of sustainability, so ESG factors and integration of them in agri-food sector, I think are becoming, will become key for sure. And they are coming into the process I would say very quickly. And we start from the environmental aspect, and of course, social and governance aspects are also will become important, I think, in a few years when social taxonomy will be ready.
Okay, thank you. Another thing that I would like to pick up a bit from the presentation of the keynote that I found it interesting, the dual technologies, dual purposes, and the things that they bring into the investment, more diverse and more profitable, maybe, investment opportunities. Could you elaborate a bit more? You mentioned a few examples that maybe unlocks the potential for the future investments to be made in this sector, maybe not directly, but due to the dual technologies used. Could you elaborate a bit more what opportunities it offers, and maybe also the panelists? Do you see some examples happening around?
Yeah, I'm very happy to. This is what we've been focusing on the last 10 years. Basically, Europe is very ambitious in renewables. It's the most ambitious continent in the world. The number one problem, there's nowhere to put the solar and wind. For instance, in Germany, simply there's no onshore wind available because there's no land. They have to literally, now the new government is going to free up some land, but you're always in this competition with either forests, which you need also to keep because they absorb CO2, or you're in competition with the agriculture. So one solution is, why don't we use land for both purposes, agriculture and solar? For a long time, I think the agriculture sector has been very skeptical because it's a nuisance. Why would you have these panels in the middle of your field? But I think as, first of all, it becomes technologically much cheaper, we have access to cheaper technology, you have subsidies, and the grid, I think this is key. The electrical grid starts participating and gives you access points. Then it's just another revenue stream, and it's also helps to de-risk agriculture because it's steady. You know, you can predict how much solar generation you will get or wind generation you will get. So when you have very volatile streams of income and you have bad years, don't forget the reason why investors don't like agriculture because of its very volatile profile. Yes, if you talk to any farmer, he will say, over 10 years, I can produce this. But investors don't work on these kind of long-term horizons. It's usually 5 years. So, but if you diversify your risk and you have a revenue stream from solar, let's say, then it becomes much more interesting. And it's the same land that they're using. So I think from financial point of view, it's very interesting for both investors and farmers. And I think from political standpoint, this is the path. This is the direction of travel.
Okay, thank you so much. Mika, maybe you could reflect on this. Do you see this as an opportunity maybe to diversify the risk and also the investment opportunities in this respect? Huh?
Yeah, like I said already, there are several sustainability risks that are opportunities. I think one of the main topics to be solved is the future scenarios. Do we actually know how to produce food in the future? And do we have a direction to guide, for example, research, education, and how do we make sure we have capabilities to produce food in the future? So a clear direction is needed, and that direction should actually guide us through the revolution.
Thank you. Grigoris, maybe you can add on this.
I think that in the agri-food sector, we are used more or less in absorbing technologies developed elsewhere. And there is a good explanation for that. Agri-food sector is by definition a low margin sector. This means that the research very often happens in other sectors and then the results are transferred to agriculture. I can give you a very concrete example. We heard in the morning the story about the need to move to alternative proteins, to stop consuming meat, livestock in the industrial livestock system as we do today. For example, the lab-grown meat is a technology that first was created by biomedical reasons. It was created as tissue engineering to create transplant, etc. And then now we are trying to push the technology into more affordable pathways in order to be able to be used in really producing meat that we can consume. So this is, I think, a thing we have seen also with robotics, we have seen with many other things. I think that the key here is for the agri-food sector to identify or to invent effective mechanisms to get results from other sectors and apply them quickly and customize them according to the needs of the sector.
But if following on this, but what could be the mechanisms? I mean, to find these mechanisms is an ambitious goal for the future, but do you have a clue or some guidance on what kind of mechanisms it could be? I mean, is it a role for the government to play? I don't know, orchestrating the digital innovation hubs that kind of brings the solutions and tests the solutions together with the farmers and food makers, or there are other means to achieve that?
I think I'm looking at Mika because my personal belief is that this is the role of the smart capital, the smart money to play. I can give you another concrete example. I have been to Israel a couple of years ago, and what we have seen is technologies, robotic technologies that they were used for cleaning minefields to be used for harvesting fruit in the field. And this was a project that was really financed by Israeli VCs from the army. They saw the technologies inside the army and they financed to bring them out in the real market. Just to give you an example of how this can happen.
Mika, maybe you can reflect on this.
Those are exactly the examples needed here to solve the risks in the current system and spread the word and get new technology outside the current system to actually solve the challenges. These are examples. I really like them. Thanks.
Also, we have the topic, on one hand, the investments, but on the other hand, the financing. And I mean, we can reflect a bit on the governmental role in this. I mean, talking about the different grants, different very high risk funding options that the companies in the sector could take as an opportunity, and also later on with the investment, venture capital, and so on. But when it comes to the financing, the Green Deal measures that has been mentioned, different funding options that would evolve. What role of these measures, the funding, subsidies, grants, and other things that complement to some extent to the evolution of the agri-food sector, which priorities, which opportunities you could highlight from this? I start with maybe with Paulius mentioning some of the Green Deal measures. So what to highlight, what to expect from these funding options, I would say, for agri-food sector?
Well, one broad comment. I don't want to be playing the devil's advocate and focusing too much on risks, but I have to point out one of the biggest threats to the sector is that it's highly subsidized, as Villy mentioned, the common agricultural policy. For an investor, the key question is, well, what is your ROI? What's your return on investment? How much revenue are you actually going to generate from business as opposed to subsidies? Unfortunately, one of the negatives from Green Deal, again, you talk about technology acquisition, etc. And farmers are very happy to acquire technology so long as they are subsidized. And I think it's very important that we don't just acquire technologies for the sake of technologies, right? It has to make business sense. And the other point I will add, in Lithuania at least, the farmers have just invested into new technology. So they've just bought new tractors, they bought new equipment. It's very important also just to focus on transition. So we don't simply dump the old assets, all that, and buy some new fancy equipment. So that's point one. But I think the most exciting part, I think, is actually digitalization, because I think, as we all know, it's a highly complex process that if you can actually manage it through a computer and you can see how you can basically calibrate how much fertilizer you can need to inject at what point, at what time, you are saving a lot. It's good for the soil, it's good for your economy. It's basically, and you're basically using less resource. So I think digitalization will be number one. And I think that's a huge focus. Second one is automation, right? So that's part of it. If you know what's going on, then you can actually automate it and calibrate it. And then, of course, I do believe, I already mentioned renewables, that's evident. And I think that eventually there will be focus also on mobility. Right now, people are skeptical because they think that tractors are too big to run on batteries. But I think it's just a matter of maybe another 12 to 24 months. We see the battery technologies moving really, really fast. So I think electrification will come, but it's more 2 years out. That's what I would say. And of course, focus on ecological farming.
Okay, yeah, with these notes, thank you so much, Paulius. Maybe we can step into the mode of the wrapping up and concluding. So therefore, I ask the panelists maybe also to add their view on the most promising areas for the investments that just has been highlighted. Maybe there is some things overlooked, and maybe your views on where are these main prospects for the investments into the agri-food sector for the upcoming 5 years, let's say, and maybe even further on for upcoming 10 years. Some trends that you see that you could, secretly transfer to the investors that are listening for us now, pinpointing some of the important aspects for the future. Paulius correctly mentioned some his views. Where are the most promising areas? I turn to, Grigoris now with you to wrap up and to highlight some additional aspects.
Some areas that I have already mentioned, for example, I believe very much in the introduction of robotics, the automation part. I believe very much in the introduction of technologies for alternative proteins. But I also believe very much into something that was mentioned in the morning about regenerative agriculture, about the possibility of carbon farming, about the possibility of really using farming not only as a method to produce our food, which is absolutely necessary, but also as a way to reduce the harm we are causing to the environment.
Okay, thank you. Mika, we turn to you. Any conclusions and any promising areas for the investments in agri-food sector that you see and you believe in?
Well, I would like to come back to Paulius. Thank you for your comment about transition. I think that is a really critical topic here. From the point that how do we make sure that the system, what comes to subsidies, for example, is fair for the new technology as well, because we are talking about being fair to the current system, but how do we ensure that we are fair what comes to subsidize to the new system? And we do see a lot of interesting startups all the time. We have been in discussions with over 550 companies during the past 2 years here in Nordics and Baltics. And of course, one of the sectors that in this topic could be the most promising is the data and how to use the data to really optimize land use and fertilizers and plant growth. For example, we have invested in nanosatellites that are providing hyperspectral data from the space to help farmers.
Great, thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe some reflections. I hear Paulius.
Yeah,
No?
no, we forgot the biggest, one of the biggest developments is, of course, artificial intelligence and big data gathering. And you mentioned satellites. I've heard some really exciting projects where you can do aerial monitoring of crops, of pesticides, of actually, you can even tell what animal health is by looking at the color. And I think this is where the revolution is happening right now in AI. And of course, this is part of digitalization, but AI element is really, really important and exciting.
Thank you. Yeah, not to overlook the important things. You know, sometimes the discussion goes, and yeah, we tend to overlook some of the important things. Thank you for highlighting, adding this up. I turn back to banks. I mean, on one hand, as the financial measure, financial institution and association, do you see some prospects for this sector to be funded and to be invested from the bank's perspective? Any prospects? Any trends that you could, you know, highlight here?
So when I listen to you, so I hear a lot of different initiatives and a lot of technologies that are already present. So perhaps it's not the problem of, you know, finding where and how to invest. Overall, our goal, our strategy as the banking sector, and it doesn't matter whether you are in Lithuania or in some other country, is green and digital transition. The same. So my message to the investors would be invest in anything that brings you at least one step further in green or digital or both transitions.
Great, great. Thank you so much. We have still a few minutes for the concluding remarks. Any messages that we left behind unattended or maybe not highlighted enough? So I will circle around the panelists for the concluding remarks on the investment opportunities and the prospects in the agri-food sector. Anything that we missed out, thematically wise, technology wise, we already highlighted. Any things that you see happening in your countries, in your institutions that basically limits or eliminates some of the bottlenecks that stops and limits the investments in the agri-food sector? Anything that actually could bring the change in making the more investments in the sometimes overlooked sector? So your conclusion maybe to the policymakers then, what could be done in order to change the conditions to averse some of the risks and maybe to make this agri-food sector a bit more lucrative for the investments? Paulius, maybe I start with you.
Yes. I mean, it's a topic I've been talking about for years, but as much as it hurts me to lose this sort of old traditional farming, I think the way forward is to transition from agriculture to agri-tech and agribusiness. I think that is the future. I think there should be fiscal incentives for farmers to establish companies, corporations that don't just depend on one guy, one man or son. As attractive as that sounds, I think if you want to have access to capital, if you want to access to technology, you need to run it as a business, more integrated, more like agri-tech business.
Thank you. Really nice remark. Thank you. I turn to Grigoris. Yeah.
I would like to see more of the resources of the sector itself being mobilized. What I mean by that, we watched a very interesting presentation in the morning about the dynamism of the French cooperatives. I would like to see cooperatives all over Europe to find a way to mobilize their resources, to mobilize their own capital, team up possibly with investors, with VCs, learn from them, and try to engage themselves into the process of investing in technologies, because I think this will bring more organic results at the end of the day.
Great. Thank you. Mika, I turn to you.
Thanks. I want to stay positive here. I have a huge respect on the research we are doing here in Baltics and Nordics. But I would really encourage all the governments to encourage researchers to start business. And what is the attitude towards academic entrepreneurship? That could be one really essential solution in transition to sustainable farming and sustainable food system.
Thank you. Note taken. And then I turn to, of course, Eivilė. Any
Yes. So if answering your question on, so what would be an advice to the policymaker? So I think an interesting sort of conclusion emerged from this conversation that indeed subsidies play quite a key role because they are also sort of, they trigger new technologies to come in. And if the policymakers are not yet sort of aware of new technologies there, so those technologies might get less subsidies. So I think that's a very important message to the policymakers, for them to understand that actually it depends on them how fast the sector is going to make its transition.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, the panelists, with really content-rich suggestions, ideas for the investors, for the policymakers. I strongly believe that this message will go across and will reach the ears of decision makers, being it investors, private investors, public investors, policymakers, and so. So on this bombshell, I would like to finalize this session on Agri-Food investments, funding, and prospects for this. With this, I thank you so much, the presenter, keynote speaker that made a miraculous presentation, and also the panelists that contributed a lot with the thoughts and ideas that make this actually possible, and ideas that will generate the main key points for the conclusions of this event. It will be definitely transferred.